Good afternoon, everybody. So excited to be here, and thanks to Figma for hosting this conference and inviting me to speak. I'm really honored to be here. My name's Nathan Curtis. I, like they said, hail from Fairfax, Virginia, near Dulles Airport, if you know where that is. And I started H-Apes with Dan Brown in 2006, and ever since then, I've been rocking on design systems projects. So we didn't call them that in 2006, but my first library, sun.com, still in love, one of my favorites. And I hope that you are having the same connection to yours. I do a lot of writing on medium.com. I write about crafting component API and naming tokens and all that kind of stuff. And so you can find me at Nathan A. Curtis. And I write from where I find inspiration. And my inspiration is my projects. And 4 clients in the last year have had problems similar to what I'm going to walk through here. They say, I need this card. Okay, we've got these really powerful components and all these great things in Figma, and they need to produce this card, and in that card is this set of property value pairs with this little tooltip icon in the middle. And so what they do is they go to the library, and they grab the card, they place it, and then once they place it, they start to configure it. They say add a description, add some metadata, let's put some actions on the bottom, and then they think to themselves, wait, how do I get the property value pair in there? What am I supposed to do? How do I do this? And they look at all the rich things in your examples, so many different things you can do with that card. Create states like focus, change the size of typography and the amount of padding, change the background color to relate that card to the surface it's on. But they also, our adopters, our DS consumers, want to do a lot of other things with those cards too, like reorder the elements to rearrange them, or to reorient them to display them horizontally, or add a dismissible X. All these different things, and when they look at the prop panel, you know what they hear, or what they feel? No, you can't do that. And so this person that wants those property value pairs, they go to the card and they want to achieve that outcome with this component, and they feel, nope, system doesn't do that. Stop doing that. Stop breaking the rules. You better not detach that thing or they're coming after you, right? No detaching. And so, well, if I'm not supposed to detach, then what am I supposed to do? I want to get these property value pairs. How do I make this work? And how do they make it work? Well, one thing they could do is ask the system to do it. System feature request time, please add all those property value pairs, and I need to configure each one to have an icon. Okay, so the system produces those things, and if the system's going to do that, it's not just the property value pairs. Suddenly you need to add a prop for the dismissible X. Suddenly you need a prop for changing the orientation to horizontal. All the things and all those features start to really crop up. Or they could build it themselves. Okay, maybe they did attach it, maybe they don't, but now they're in the frames and layers panel to create all those elements themselves. And they move over and they start adjusting all the auto layout themselves and putting those styles in themselves. So let's compare those 2 types of outcomes. If they make it from scratch, everybody in the audience here, all our DS authors, well, it's totally inefficient, totally inconsistent. That's very imprecise, don't do that. But if the system adds the props, great, it's efficient, it's consistent, I can do this precisely. But then as a design system team, you're thinking to yourself, well, if they make it from scratch, that's a smoother process, right? But if they're going to ask us to do it, it's going to be disruptive. We're going to have to maintain something that's more expensive. It's an unshared need. Keep those unshared needs out of your core library. But this conversation really stops when you're going to ask for a feature request. You're going to wait 5 months for that feature to be built? Because you have all those cool plugins, all those steps that, I really loved the earlier talk about all the steps that you go through to deliver those things, to code the component and so on. Too much time. They don't have time. They don't have 5 months. They have 5 minutes. And so is there something else that they could do? Could you take that moderately sophisticated component like a card and grab those individual subparts, like the media area with the image or the title area or the action, and offer those as smaller parts for them to compose with, so that when they need to produce the blue stuff, those property value pairs, they can add their own special stuff, and it doesn't necessarily have to land in the system. And so let's talk about the balance of trade-offs. Of course, I'm here to talk about making with subcomponents, and that might result in a more efficient, more consistent, more precise experience, but it's still a self-reliant experience for the adopter. And while the system might get engaged with office hours, there's some decisions they still need to make. Maybe improve their demos. Please continue to improve your demos of how all your increasingly sophisticated things are to put together. But it could be a good trade-off to balance these 2 opposing ends of the spectrum. And so I'm going to talk about subcomponent patterns. I'm going to walk through a few different examples of the kind of subcomponents we see, and also the containers that we might want to put them in. I'll talk a little bit about how they impact our ways of work, and then ask the question, is this really worth it? Do we really want to do this? And I've been learning lessons along the way with the teams I've been exploring this with, and you do have some challenges ahead. Subcomponents, in terms of what they are, think of it as just smaller parts made and tailored to be used within the context of a well-defined parent. Here, you have things like card media, card text, and card actions, and by prepending the name of the component, you're creating essentially a namespace that makes it clear these components are for use within this larger thing. The three patterns I want to walk through happen to also be in cards. Things like an extension, a lockup, and alternatives. So let's just briefly look at these kinds of patterns you may encounter. The first one I'm going to call a lockup. Commonly, you have multiple elements paired or coupled together, and you want to make those easy to compose with as a larger unit. I see them a lot in cards, in lists, in heroes or big billboards, lots of different places. And by doing this, you actually encapsulate things like space between, space within, and other kinds of layout and style properties, while still offering actually a pretty robust API of props on the right-hand side. The second is an extension. Think of it as we have a simpler component, but in the context of a card, we might want to actually limit the number of options, or we might want to create more options. For example, maybe a dismissible X. We could choose to do that here. But that might be a purpose to create something specifically for building cards that's built upon a simpler unit. A third type could be a way to lightly or assertively govern a closed set of alternatives you'd like them to use. So at the bottom of a card, you might want to have a primary action, you might want to have two, or you might want to pair a primary action with a secondary action. But what you don't want them to do is to have only a secondary action, or only a text button, or actually use a text button with a primary button, or stay away from the icon buttons, right? Let's be really opinionated. Prevent them from using icon buttons. I'll come back to that. Okay? The other part of thinking about subcomponents isn't just the kinds of subcomponents you have, but it's the containers you might want to drop them in. There are different kinds of containers, and you've probably heard the term slot, but there might be better language that we can use to think more precisely about different types of containers that exist in something like a card. Let's start with slot. Slot is an unopinionated block within your component where you just expect them to drop whatever they want in there. Put a rating? You could put a rating component in there. Put some property value pairs? Go ahead and drop those in there. Put a massive chart with like all sorts of data next to the chart? Okay, don't do that with a card. Should we trust them to not do that with a card? But then there are other kinds of containers too. And one of the things that we bridge to that is to think, if you take this slot-oriented mindset, you might think to yourself, I have three major elements in my card, so what is every single location in that card that I might want to also put some custom content? Now, this is an extreme example of bento boxing on the right-hand side, but it's still indicative of this instinct of, I've got a slot. More slots are better. I love my first slot. The third slot, the fifth slot might be the way to go. And there are other ways to think about composing bigger things from smaller things. One might be to think about substitution. If I need to change something about the relationship of the title and description and maybe add some extra stuff, maybe put a badge as well, maybe the mindset is I'm going to swap out the title or swap out the card text component, subcomponent for something like that thing with a badge added to it. And in that way, I can actually, as a DS consumer, start to almost be like a DS author to wire up some more props. What kind of badge am I going to have? Am I going to expose the nested instance properties of the badge within that thing that I just produced as well? A third, or one of the nice things I like about Figma as these component props change, I'm absolutely over the moon, they're doing a great job, is how easy it is to start to manipulate these things too. For example, as you drag an asset from the assets panel, you can drop it onto a substitution pattern or a slot pattern or what have you, and as long as you hit Command-Option-Drag, it's going to recognize not just a component, but nested subcomponents too, to drop those things into that place. Maybe that designer, that DS consumer, had a good reason to use icon buttons, and so they produced it themselves, they dropped it in, they solved the problem, and guess what? They didn't have to wait for 5 months. A third is to think about the card overall as a container. I use the term block. I inherited that from block element modifier, which is BEM, a convention in CSS. But think of that overall block level, and maybe you can still provide that as a container, and they can drop whatever they want in whatever order they want, with an expectation that it's going to accord to the governing principles of what a card's supposed to be. So hopefully they might be combining subcomponents and a rating, or a badge, or both, oriented in ways to solve the problem that they have. The other thing to notice is that still for the block level container, there's still an API to that. There's still rounded corners on that container. Somebody tweeted earlier, the border radius is the key to unlock all world value in design systems. But hopefully they're not updating the border radius for your card. Instead, they're taking advantage of the fact it still has its surface capabilities, it still has a state, it still has other things at that level that you want to take advantage of. The last one, and I'd say it's the rarest one, is a zone that's bigger than a single slot, but it represents an area within which they still want to compose. Cards, for example, will distinguish between image and the content. Think of the actions as maybe a subset of the content, and that text, that title and description is a subset of the content. Maybe they just need to compose in that particular zone. And so as you think hierarchically about your component, is there something between the biggest layer and the bottommost node that also might be a target that you want to compose in? And so, wow, those are 4 different patterns. Which one am I supposed to use? We've been thinking about slots for a year, and it's kind of working pretty well. As a design system author or someone pursuing or using it, don't always think in black and white. The answer might be that there are opportunities with the components that you use to combine 2 or 3 or maybe even all 4 in the way that you architect your things. Those are going to be design decisions, and taking advantage of different kinds of patterns and leveraging them to solve the problems that you have make it not an either-or kind of question. In addition, how do you offer these? You could offer them as distinct starting points, 4 different assets from the assets panel that you would drag and start with a varying level of composition to suit your interest. Or, like we saw before, you can start to integrate all of these things into a single instance. Maybe there's a compose property that defaults to the seeing all the elements and maybe exposing the slot as a second option and so on. Now that we have this robust way of thinking about our components and their architectures, we can choose and tune and please experiment with your users around what works best for them. One of the things I like to think about early in the design process, and we saw some other speakers talk about this too, was how do we get designers exploring in Figma to establish and iterate on the architecture early in that process, while perhaps at the same time when you're in that design exploration phase or even a design details phase, asking the developers to look at what's being produced and invite them to sketch in pseudocode too, and then compare the results. See how much their terminology, their hierarchy, their prop names and options and other things correspond to one another. Are they thinking the same way about anatomy and how those things fit together? Now, I find a lot of inspiration from different design systems out there, and if you're thinking about a composable system, Material UI's React library is a great one. It's like the most hyper-composable one I've seen. It's not for everybody. It doesn't mean be like them. But if you want to look at sort of this ultimate level of composability, look at the anatomy and composition of the code. As designers, you can read that stuff. It'll make sense. Okay? Look at the props. This is for the list item text. This isn't for the list item overall, just the text in a list item. And actually, there's a number of interesting properties at that lower level. And it exposes the fact that for something like a list item or a card, you'll experience a dispersion of your properties from everything at the top level to really be at lower levels and in interdependent parts. And what that means also is sometimes things start to stink. Before, with Figma yesterday, we used to have just a single component with a bunch of properties. And those wonderful enhancements we just heard about leave us today with Figma exposing nested instances and becoming clearer and clearer around how some of those properties relate hierarchically to the parts within. But also that exposes the fact that if we're going to have some interdependent parts, they might have to repeat the same kind of property to control a background color or to control a size. And maybe in the future, wink, wink, Figma, we can get to the point where we aren't just exposing nested instances, but exposing properties within exposed nested instances, and being able to maybe forward properties from something bigger to something smaller so that our consumers of the design system, when they're working with a bigger unit, aren't overwhelmed by having to configure and align all of their different knobs they're trying to tune. And so now the promise is there. We can create those cards. We can leave it to the design system consumers to build and realize what they need. In my opinion, none of these are off system. But none of these were supported by the props you DS authors offered to us. And so this would be a positive outcome for me. And so is it worth it? One of the exercises that I did when we started to explore these concepts were actually in Figma, what are all the different interactions that we do to create a prop or to leverage a property or to actually flow content into our Figma component or to adjust the style, arrange the layout, or even add extra elements that add more things to anatomy. Those are all actions that you do. And if you look at the 3 different types of things I talked about, first, making it from scratch, second, composing with subcomponents, and third, just getting the system to add the props for you as a feature request, you can really compare once somebody wants to create this kind of component that you see with the property value pairs, how much do they need to work? And gosh, look at that right-hand column. All they need to do is drop the component, flow in some content, and configure some props. It's so easy. That is a false comparison. Because number 1, it's going to take them 5 months to get it. And number 2, the system, you don't want those shared needs in there. So if you're thinking about subcomponents, to me, that's a distraction. That is disabling your customers from realizing their destiny with efficiency. Instead, how do you think about the other 2 columns? Well, the reality is that property value list, they're going to have to do that work either way. So really what you're trying to compare is, you want them making from scratch, what are they going to do and what's it going to expose? Or can you provide them with smaller parts that solve style issues, that solve layout issues, that actually increase precision because those smaller parts have properties for them to tune rather than for them to manipulate it themselves. And so what have I learned so far with the teams I've been blessed to work with? First is people will persist their habits. Figma's going to continue to change. Did you see that timeline? It went from 2016 to 2020. And then it went to 2022. I hope 2023 and 2023 and a half. And it just keeps changing. But people are going to learn Figma at their own rates. And so they're going to continue to click through and persist their habits of how they've been used to working with not just Figma the tool, but how your system is exposing its features through the tool too. The next thing is people have their own preferences around defaults. On the one hand, some people like, show me everything. Show me the kitchen sink. Let me prune away the things I don't need. Others may benefit from, just show me the basics, and I'm going to add that metadata. Then I'll add that description. Then I'll flow in that thing into that slot. And so how are you going to gauge with your customers what the right choices are? The next one is projection. As DS authors, we are accustomed to being power users, like they said. And so as you think about the power usage and the opinions that you have, I am so opinionated myself, and I need to check that at the door sometimes. But still, you might react to, wow, this seems pretty hard. When the reality is, okay, they need to deal with the fact that when they swap something, it might change it from a hug to a fixed, and you need to adjust that too. But those are small speed bumps, potentially on the road to enabling them to be successful. Next, prop blindness. Oh my gosh, those lists are long. I did an experiment where a trial run the task was change the size, make it large. And they were hovering over that thing. And it was like size, medium in the dropdown. I was like, click it, come on, it's right there. You're hovering right over top of it. But there's so much to consume there that they can get overwhelmed. But lastly, it's still effort. If you want to enable them to compose themselves, that means that they need to accept the fact and be prepared they're going to have work to do. And how are you going to communicate to them how much less work they have to do? How much better the things are they're producing because of the work that you've already done and how you've prepared parts for them to use. And so as you think about the challenges that are ahead, ground yourself in how a design system thinks of itself as a success. Are you creating efficiency? And if so, is this a risk for them to learn more smaller parts, learn how to compose, continue to learn how Figma's evolving? The second thing, or number 3 is, are they satisfied? Because I'll tell you what, it's kind of more complex. It's going to have some learnability. But it's flexible, empowering, and they can deliver their stuff in a timely way. Second, Quality, legitimate concern. If you give them smaller parts, it's going to be more upon their responsibility to make sure it's accessible, make sure it's usable, make sure it's performant on the front end. And so as you think about those things, how do your examples and your documentation and your reference builds and the other things you have in your repertoire of design system assets help them to achieve these levels of quality? But number one, this is what freaks out all the design system people I work with, is consistency. And can you please just trust your DS consumers more? They are not out to create this monstrosity with rainbow text, images at the top and the bottom. Notice that dismissible X in the lower left-hand corner. Isn't that awesome? Okay? They're not going to do that. They're barely poking around the edge, asking you questions in the Slack channel saying, what do you think about property value pairs so that for my event I can show how much it costs and what the max capacity is? And can I do that in a card? And the answer, I hope, is yes. And so as you think about their destiny, they own it. They're responsible for it. And you are there to equip them to achieve that destiny, not control and command them to only achieve the destinies that you've deemed worthy of them achieving. And so as you go down this path, and you will continue to be confronted by, should we make this thing configurable? Should we make that thing composable? It's not a black or white question. You could actually choose to make the very common things configurable and also give them the tools and the approaches to make the uncommon things composable so they can solve the problems themselves. Thanks so much. Have a great Schema.